Good evening. You're listening live to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Alongside me tonight, I have from the great Midwest, the free state of the USA, according to tonight's film, RDV. And of course, the film I'm talking about is 1984's release of Patrick Swayze, a Patrick Swayze special. Let's not forget there's a lot of other wonderful people in here, such as Powers Boothe and a few others we'll talk about in a moment, called Red Dawn. So, Red Dawn, Red Skies at Night, War, blah, blah, blah. Any 80s growing up RDV, I will tell you this. Anything that wasn't America wasn't number one, and especially the Russians, because while China was sitting back licking its chops, saying, "Okay, you go ahead, Ruskies, do your thing. We'll kill them from in the middle." The Russians, the former USSR, which no longer exists, were getting spent into oblivion, thanks to, or not thanks to, Ronald Reagan. So this was kind of like a big deal, and the reason why I say that it's because when I rewatched this movie, I had not seen it in a very long time. I'm talking about 20 years or so, and I'm not even going to talk about the so-called reboot or whatever 10 years ago. Which, ugh. But this movie, RDV, I forgot kind of how serious it takes itself, and then I
Yeah.
realized, oh, it's John Milius. Oh, no wonder, because him and he did Conan, which I think is one of the best movies of the '80s, one of my personal favorites. But the soundtrack, I'm like, who did this? It sounds like Conan, and it's Basil
Yep.
Poledouris, which it has some great stuff. So it leveled up immediately just because of those two talents in there. Well, and actually, it's what I would call a libertarian type film, and not that we talk politics so much on here, but it really is about, hey, if such a really weird thing would happen, how would it go down? And people thought at the time it was really, really silly and they ignored it. But now they look at it kind of like, you know what, America number one. This is just feed the masses with this kind of stuff. We're somehow our teenagers in high school are going to defeat everybody. And so on that kind of level, it works. But a
Well,
lot of people at the time didn't like how serious it was. I had no problem with it. I actually preferred it that way.
and I love this movie. It's done very, very well. In a sense, there's a scene where you got these Russian shoulders. They're in a jeep, and Swayze's got a gun on the guy. The kid is like probably no, probably a little older than Swayze is in this movie,
Hmm.
and he's got tears in his. Got he doesn't want to die, so he turns his head, and then you hear in the distance a gunshot, and it just shows you that horror is horrible. A thing, and I love that they did get serious because they could have went so many routes with this, but these are just regular kids. They grew up a little bit. The thing is between back then and today, I think a lot more people were brought up as far as learning how to hunt. You knew somebody, your grandfather, your uncle, or your dad took you hunting. You knew you were self sufficient. You had to be, and
Yes.
yeah. So then I somewhere between the late '80s and then in the '90s, it's still parts of the day, but it's not really pushed. It's not really a big thing. Now, then again, they could be in certain groups, because I know the NRA. There are programs for 12-year-olds go get their rifles and stuff. It's legal for them in certain states. Here in Wisconsin, a 12-year-old can have a rifle. But it's so back then it was kind of more in this movie. It was kind of more believable. I mean, if we ever were invaded, because right now, look at our country. We're so cocky, man. We could be invaded. Uh, that now we always say like, well, we have the technology, but if there's no one running the country, or if the country is corrupt as it is, we'd always get a corrupt policy. You talk about the authoritarian, dictator government. Like right now they're talking about they want to ban guns. Can you imagine this movie if nobody had a gun and we're invaded? This movie would have been Russia towards the end. uh, it's like I said, it's one of the more important. I always say when you watch movies like this, a gun is a tool. A gun doesn't kill people. A person kills a person, and it shows you the effects it has on other people. Uh, and especially when there's a speech in there after one of the younger kids gets shot and killed, and they have a little funeral for him. And he says I can't wait till we get back to the point where a country where kids don't have to be adults anymore. They can be kids. You know.
I think, when you look at this film, if you just watch it superficially, you just say, oh, it's a product of the '80s with the high
Yeah.
school version taking itself a bit seriously. Okay, whatever. It's it's more of a Milius type film because he'd been around for so long. He's been involved in a lot of really great screenplays, and he has a lot of interesting ideas in that they're different from the Hollywood norm, yeah, especially by today's standards and definitely by 80s. But I think the thing about self-sufficiency, we've talked about before on the Extreme Movie Show that you don't see a lot of wholesome films anymore, and you don't see a lot of films that focus on character. These days, it's all CGI and everything's paper thin. And when you go back just a couple years with Conan, some of the themes in there that don't necessarily stick out you as being very important. If you look at this film and compare them, you go, oh yeah, it's exactly the same thing. So Subotai and Conan was the thief that he befriended, and they became buddies. They were very loyal. Of course, he met his lover there, and the three of them traveled around doing their things. But you see that, like when she dies in Conan and comes back kind of to help out in one of the final battles there. So you have this thing about loyalty and friendship and the bonds that you have and how things affect you. And also, you could argue about Conan, despite the fact that he was forced into slavery, that he became so good, however, for whatever reasons for it, that his owner said, hey, I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to free you. And that's kind of interesting because in here, you've got a bunch of kids that are self-sufficient. They don't necessarily want to have to be in the position they're in, but they have to because their parents are captured, and they're just doing what they need to. And I thought it was cool when the older parents basically said, when they were talking to them, hey, with all this crap that's going on, we pretty much raised you to be this way, so we expect you to act that way. And I always thought it was super cheesy as a kid watching this when the Wolverines, the group that's in
Yeah,
hiding and doing all these things, they would do something and then their army would come back and basically kill a group of whatever. And it's like, the kids are singing, America the Beautiful and all that. Then they get wiped out and you're like,
yeah,
they're not screwing around here a little bit. And so I don't think this is really a pro-war film or anti-war.
no,
I just think it's if it were to happen in the United States, here's the reasonable way it would, as far as coming from Alaska. And then when Powers Booth, of course, shows up and basically fills in all the adult data for the high schoolers,
yeah,
that's kind of adds a bit more, I think, seriousness to it, because he's always a badass. And we've reviewed Southern Comfort with him here on the Extreme Movie Show. We've talked about other
yeah,
things during the 80s. We just got done talking about Swayze last weekend on the evil skating bad guy show, Skate Town USA. But Swayze really at this point, along with a lot of other people in here, Leah Thompson and whatnot, are coming into their own in the 80s. So it was a nice way of capturing all these actors as they were up and coming in their late teens, early 20s and forward. So it was just a nice little film. It was a little different because it wasn't really rah, patriotic, cheerleader like we would talk about with, say, Commando or some other type thing like Rocky IV. This has got a serious tone to it. And when you watch it, it stops being cute after about 20, 30 minutes. And you're like, crap, I got at least another hour to go. And then if you're not ready for that, it's going to throw you off. And when it came out, that was the big argument. Oh, everyone thought it'd be a cute, fun one. No, it's serious. And it just shocked me today how much that kind of stayed. It didn't lose that over the years. You know what I mean?
yeah. I'm going through the cast list. I'm looking like the majority of the people that were in this movie are now aged out and died. That's it's crazy to think about that.
Yeah.
Even Powers Booth, man, that's sad. That's I forgot that he passed away.
Yeah, and the thing of it too is when you have people up and coming like Powers Booth, he had a certain Texan Southern type of strength and charisma to him. I think you need that there because it's still basically high schoolers, and even though you've got Swayze in there and he's a very likable guy with charisma, everybody else was still kind of getting theirs. And you know, without diving, like I say, too deep into
Huh?
politics and all that stuff, it was really, really important for a film to kind of show certain things like loyalty and friendship and how it works. And we've talked about how in the 80s, the action films kind of got overdone. And when they went to all explosions and then later on in the 90s with CGI, you lose a lot because you're not basing a film on something real. And um, obviously, a lot of people associated with the Extreme Movie Show are involved in comics and other media as far as reviews go. And well,
Yeah,
Milius was a big anti-comic book graphic novel kind of guy. He's like, no, that's great when you're a kid, but when you're an adult, it's going to be, you know, brotherhood, loyalty. How do adults handle situations? How can you be self-sufficient? And all those old school Western type elements, he really preferred, and I enjoy them. And obviously, things have changed since the 80s when it comes to mainstream acceptance with comic books and graphic novels, because you've got tons of movies out now making tons of money. But a movie like this, like I say, it came out, and when you heard about it, you'd be like, oh yeah, Patrick Swayze and these group of kids, they're fighting the evil Russians, and they're up in the woods, and it's wintertime, and they're trying to learn how to survive, and they're trying to do all these things. And it's basically true. But what a lot of people that kind of didn't like it was, some people thought, it's a little slap in the face of people that were in Vietnam or World
Oh
War
yeah,
II or Korea, because how dare you put kids in a
yes,
situation like that? Or even worse, how dare you flip the script and make America the one where groups of people are having to fight like the Viet Cong were doing and such too. And
yeah, because they're saying that, because like I said back then in the
yeah,
'80s, yeah, we were really gung ho for pro-American, but it's you look at what the media, how everything is, the circus that's going around today in politics stuff, and you look at just you, you see it, and you're like, okay, this movie could happen for real life. It could happen, and we could have pockets, of like where people resistance, but we wouldn't like in this movie, we wouldn't end the war with one little guy here. It's up in the air, and then the worst part is that I could see our own government turning on us. Because they're like in league with somebody else. It's like I said, it's crazy. I mean, what we
your NWOWEF conspiracy theories, globally speaking, are not anything
well
new.
no
They've been
we,
around
we,
for a good 50,
well I'll
75
just say
years
this.
at least.
I'll drop the subject, but I'll just end with this for the subject. When you have a guy who served in World War II who's over 100 years old, and just before he passed away, he said, "I didn't give my and then go to war. My brothers and sisters give their lives for free for this crap that's currently in our country." So yeah, I mean, let's talk about this. We can talk about this sequel. Sequel had for a little bit quickly. They tried to update this movie, saying an EMP knocked out most of our technology and most of the towns. They tried taking over the Koreans,
Hmm.
which to me seems more believable than the Russians.
Well, I mean, things have changed in that time period.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
China's the predominant
yeah,
threat to the United States.
yeah.
It's
It's
the
like
big power. Russia still has some stuff going on, and so it's just now more out in the open. I mean, it's not that the Chinese were weak back then; they were just in the background. Everybody was focused on the big red scare.
yeah. Like I said, I can understand why some people didn't like this, because it comes off kind of like making America look weak, you know. But that's the great thing about fantasy. I love dystopian future movies, where society, like, has pretty much been almost wiped out, you know. And, I like survival movies like that. So that's what I look at with this movie. It's just something, but the crazy thing about this, so I could see something like this actually happening in our country, and that scares the crap out of me, because it's very possible. Will it happen? I don't know, but it's always in the back of your mind.
It's not in mine, because things would be worse before that would happen. And you're talking really the third or
Well,
fourth, or pretty
you're
much the last stage of war, which is the kinetic part to it. And the way everything is now, it wouldn't be a physical invasion like this too. You would have your economic stuff going on. You would have
Oh yeah, it'd be
you know,
from within.
different cultures, changing things up and all that too, to try to dethrone America, economically speaking. And that's really what it kind of comes down to. So physically, back then as a kid, it simplifies it, doesn't it? Where you sit there and say, oh, we see people parachuting into the town, and a high schooler see them, and you're like, hey, this is kind of a cool, weird idea. But from a kid's perspective, you're like, that's what because you're in school, and to see something like that's different, it's tangible. It doesn't talk about everything else that's going on with politics and the enemy from within being involved in all that stuff there too. 'Cause nobody wants to see a movie about all that. This is much more, like I say, tangible and immediate, where you can react to it. And so something like this would just, I think, be a bit different in today's society. But I think the movie's really not about that so much as it's about the group of kids together with some of the
Yeah,
adults. And I think the kids actually, for what it's worth, whether even though they're self-sufficient, they're still kids, so they don't have this adult perspective, right? So they
yeah,
really, I think, are honoring the fact that the parents and the adults, um, you could argue it's a coming of age story with the point you made earlier about how later on they say we hope the world can be back to a place where kids don't have to be adults. Well, because because they've had to be adults earlier than what they wanted to, and that's life. And thankfully, they had parents that would prepare them for it in a way you could say that's a win for the family unit. And it's interesting because you get some of these ideas being talked about not anywhere in the beginning of the film or necessarily even in the middle. It's more towards the end, and it's not necessarily like a happy ending, but I'm not saying it's a loser or
Yeah,
bad ending
yeah,
for the United States either, right? That's the thing that makes this
yeah.
film different, you know?
I remember watching this and I'm seeing it's like, and then the two main characters, Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze, at the end, I'm like, you're just sitting on the bench. I'm like, Charlie Sheen's pretty much dead.
Yeah.
And then Swayze's like, he's been shot. Obviously, he was already shot once. And then you see because then the guy, he kills the one guy by the train yard, but I'm sure he took 4 more shots, and he carries his brother. You get the Cuban leader basically, he lets him go, walk away because he's pretty much like he realizes how much he's lost in this war, and it's not worth it killing them because they're pretty much dead. And I was just like, then like the main characters are pretty much, you killed up all the main characters except for Leah Thompson.
Yeah.
I was just like, this is depressing. But then I thought about it. It's like, you know what? There is no happy endings anymore. You're not guaranteed survival. So
Well, I mean, happy is where you walk away kind of with a smile on your face and you feel
yeah,
satisfied at the ending. I mean, that's how I look at it. But yeah, I think the whole idea here was to present it, and by flipping the script with America kind of being on the receiving end and not necessarily saying it's a win or a loss at the end, even though they say they win. It's things have changed now forever. So I think it was more of the, hey, if I present the movie to you this way, here's something that might shock you a little bit and make you think. And it's true. There's not a lot of movies out there that are like that. And it's not that America is being crapped on in this film so much as just saying if certain things were to happen at that particular time, about 50 years ago, this is how it might play out. And I like it because it's different. And like you mentioned before with dystopian movies, the idea with a lot of dystopian fiction, even the juvenile type there that some people like, is kids coming to a point where they almost have to learn to create their own society and learn how to get along. And it's not so much like Lord of the Flies, young children, that kind of society, but so much as people that have some skills and have to do stuff. And, that's why there's a pretty strong element with that in some of the I hate to say it because I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the films or the actors or actresses in it, but the Mockingbird movies and some other ones too have an element of this running through it. The Divergent series, the Maze Runner and all that. So dystopian can be good as long as it just isn't there just as a setting. If you take some of the ideas in it, like from this movie and here, you see that, and that's pretty freaking cool because teenagers don't get it. It's okay. What magical creature am I going to fall in love with and, not have any other human live up to those standards, right? I mean, it's kind of silly.
yeah, and I'm reading how this movie could have been, like, people didn't like this movie. It could have been a whole lot worse. Walter Hill he passed up on this. Imagine if he would have said yes. We
might have had Diane Lane in it.
Yeah, and she would have been, instead of Jennifer Lane being shot, you would have been pissed.
That would have been a distraction. Let's talk a little bit. Let's circle back here to something you mentioned before about how in 2012 they tried to reboot it or relaunch it, and we've talked about how since the mid 2000s, there's definitely been a very strong reboot influence of 80s pop culture, and of course, every 20, 30 years, basically a generation. The young generation at the time is now older, and they're the ones in charge, and so they make movies and television shows based on that. And with the amount of additional content that's out there, say 4 or 5 times worth what we were used to seeing, maybe even more, you're going to get some of this, and that's kind of cool. So in a way, I almost didn't mind it because I thought, well, it's my time now. Let's see what they do with the 80s. And most of it's been a miss, and it's not the 80s stuff. It's the fact that people don't get what made whatever movie or spinoff popular. And so if you take something like 21 Jump Street, which is a TV show on Fox in the late 80s to early 90s, and you just make a comedy movie loosely based off of it, people aren't going to care. But when you take something as iconic and associated with the 80s, like Red Dawn, and you try to redo it, unless you keep those same themes up and spiritually try to be a successor to it, it's gonna suck. And so all these reboots, for God's sakes, just don't work from the get-go. They're doomed to fail.
I gotta say, even though it was not as popular, I did still like the 2012 film. but not as good as original. There's parts in it I liked about that movie, but there's parts I hated it. But I said yeah, I'm not really a fan of reboots, but the reason I saw the remake because I had two big reasons. You had Adriana Palicki and Jeffrey Dean Morgan.
Oh, that's right. Overrated, but yeah, there you go.
Overrated.
Oh my God, Jeffrey Dean Morgan's in it. It's got to be good. Yeah.
This is before Walking Dead, bro.
I know that.
So that's when I saw this. It was before Walking Dead.
Yep.
He was on Supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you watch that show, you really had no idea. Unless he was in a few movies, like The Losers, but he wasn't that popular.
But the movie didn't even bother trying to.
No, it didn't. It did. It changed it. It tried updating it, and then it changed a few things, but like having Josh Peck, the guy from Drake and Josh,
Mm-hmm.
that kid being like younger brother, where Charlie Sheen being the younger brother in the original movie. Like, I thought Josh Peck was a better Matt Eckert than Charlie Sheen was.
And that's fair.
Yeah.
I think when we talk about 80s films and how people just don't get it, and I've mentioned this before about how Stranger Things is really declined a lot, especially since the first season. I think you kind of roughly agree. But like, for example, you take a movie like Fright Night. You're not a big horror fan, and I get it. And I am, and we don't really cover them a lot here on Extreme Movie Show, even though we'll cover old classics and science fiction and horror and other things. I actually didn't think the Fright Night sequel or reboot, starring Colin Farrell, was actually that bad. Now, it was a little fantastical or whatever. It wasn't as whimsical as the first one or whatever. The first one definitely had an 80s kind of charm and feel to it. But I thought if you take something, you go, okay, I want to take this basic idea and I want to make it updated for the current times that we're in. You can do that on a film that's somewhat paper thin like Fright Night was. And Fright Night was good because it was fairly simple but executed well, whereas you take something like Red Dawn, which has a lot more potential meat on the bone for what they're trying to do and being serious about it. If you do that, you just you just can't fake that, and so sometimes the lighthearted material, you can repurpose it and make it palatable by today's standards, and even then it's a crapshoot, but not like Red Dawn. So I don't disagree in that the Red Dawn reboot, I thought visually was kind of decent looking, and it's got Chris Hemsworth in it, I think, too. So you've got people that look like the role, and some of them may have acted better, but when you think of Red Dawn, everyone goes, oh, that was the one with Patrick Swayze because we like Patrick Swayze so much. And I don't think I didn't really see a reason why the reboot was there other than somebody said, hey, let's reboot an 80s thing. All right, let's do this. Let's do that. It comes across that way when you watch the reboot.
Well, that was a nostalgia craze. I think was it early 2000s, 2007 or 2009. I remember when you're talking about that Fright Night reboot with Jerry, our buddy Colin Farrell, which actually, for being reboots, I like it better. I like that version better than the original. There I say it. I usually don't like reboots, but that was actually surprised me. But yeah, that was the whole thing. And then I also can't get down on reboots. I can't be say like, oh, I hate reboots, because the Blob's been made like 3 or 4 times now. Same with Division of the Body Snatchers. It's nothing new. It's just that but I will agree with you and say this. It's a cheap way to make money. In this case, Red Dawn, the reboot bombed. Did not make money.
No.
But as I said, getting back to this, I think more people like this movie because of Swayze, and then that's pretty much it. Because we have a fascination with Patrick Swayze, how he delivers his lines. He was a phenomenal actor. The guy was good looking, man. He had the charisma. He had the range as far as acting chops. Even in
unbelievable.
He was
like the older brother, a couple years older than you. That when the shit's on, you're like, okay. I remember him showing me how to do stuff, but now it's on. So all of a sudden you're like, bam, he's like that big brother.
That's why before this he did that movie, The Outsiders, which I think is one of his better films.
It's a good one. It is.
Yeah. And he did play the older brother, with Charlie Sheen was there too as well, and I believe Tom Cruise was in there.
One thing I want to touch on is one of the comments one of our commenters make here in chat, Dave, where he talks about how John Emilius, how this film kind of got him blacklisted in Hollywood. There's a documentary on the guy, and he's been purported to be like this hardcore conservative right winger or whatever. And while politics, I'm gonna say, it hasn't necessarily changed a whole hell of a lot. The way things are presented certainly are, and so Milius will say, "Oh, I'm really a libertarian, or I'm an anarchist, or this or that, or what," and he's really kind of working people over with that stuff, because if you're, libertarian is somebody that believes in liberty and, being self-sufficient, so almost no government at all. So in a way that you kind of see that in this film here, because, a lot of America is destroyed. It's just that center part. You could argue that's being metaphorical for the center of both sides, right? I mean, it's so blatant, right? But something like, minimum wage is a concept that, a true libertarian, a hardcore one, would say, well, it should be zero, because the government should not be involved in, you or I entering into agreement between ourselves as a private party for what I'm willing to pay you or what you're willing to pay me. And then a lot of people yell and scream, oh no, it's got to be this little something. And then you get people saying, well, why not make it 100? What about universal basic income, all this stuff? And a lot of people just forget the fact that, there's producing and there's consuming, and you're one or the other, and you do both. And it's interesting how in the 80s, with consumerism starting to be on a high because of how bad the 70s were, that people made an extra conscious effort to sit there and say, no, I earned this. I deserve it. I'm going to go work out. I'm going to go spend my money. I'm going to go do this. I'm going to consume. And it was celebrated. And it wasn't celebrated in terms of being greed and disgusting, like you're a fat cat because of government. It was because you, as an individual, produced it. And it was like one of the last little pushes of liberty, I think, that existed in pop culture was this little greed is good being celebrated in the 80s.
I almost wonder if they would have made this more like a Goonies type of movie, like a feel good where nobody died and the characters get like happy and we defeated them, like more like a really unbelievable, like kind of like a Spielberg movie in a sense.
It'd have been awful, and you know what that movie was?
And it would have been awful, but I think it would have made more money. I guarantee it probably would have made more money, and it would become more of a cult hit. Where this is kind of like. Remember that movie where these football players, took on the Russians and the Cubans? Wait, really? That happened? Yeah, that happened. Wow. That sounds horrible. Let's go watch it. Why? Because Patrick Swayze's in there.
Well, let me bring this up. You and I pretty much started the Xtreme movie show on the back of some of our personal favorites. So we did a lot of like Jean-Claude Van Damme and Chuck Norris movies, right? So going back to Chuck Norris, we talk about how everything's a build up, for the one big kick at the end, or, the one stunt, the good guys wear black, where he jumps and does karate kicks through the windshield and kicks the guy off just badass kind of real life stunts. I have to point this out for if somebody wants to play devil's advocate and say, well, this is really the first American invasion film before Invasion USA with our boy Chuck. But that was a Chuck Norris film that just had that as a backdrop. That's the way I look at it, okay? Yeah. This is not that kind of a film. So, it's kind of funny thinking about it, but we go, well, who would we send out there to destroy everybody? Well, obviously be Chuck Norris, and it proved it because it starts down in Florida in the swamps. But no, the more serious take on it's obviously Red Dawn. And to your point, that's why it wasn't digestible. And a lot of films that were really trying to present something did not do well, because even though people knew it, they wanted that sugar high of these 80s films. And I mentioned before with the Goonies, God, a movie that's done really, really well, but I go at it. I just don't see it. I don't get it. Give me Red Dawn over Goonies any day. I know it's a hot take, right? But
I'll just say
think Red Dawn's really that good of a film. It really is.
It is, and I'll just say this: if you were on the fence, but you should watch or not, one of these critics said, "Oh, it feels like a Republican wet dream manifested into a surrealistic, really a nightmare." Dude, like, if that doesn't make you want to go watch it just to see how bad it is or how good it is, like, I like watching movies that people say are the worst movies, or because like especially when you say like it's your Republican wet nightmare. Like, so basically, you don't like the movie because it's makes people look good because they have guns. Like, is this? I hate when people are like anti-gun because it's like it's just the thought process is like, okay, you may not know how to own a gun, but if you're anti other people having guns to defend themselves, you just come off as an idiot. So if you hate this movie because there's guns in it, now I want to go watch it because I want to see what's triggering you. Pun intended.
Remember when we covered all the Dirty Harry movies? We just went in order.
Yeah.
One of the things we talked about then, how in the early 70s, the whole idea of the gun and this being in San Francisco is you could already tell
horrified. You can't watch a movie.
Ago. Well, the point is in the movies, it was presented about how awful it was, and you got a very progressive feeling to what was thought of in Hollywood coming out to you on film, where it might have been a bit more subversive back in the 50s and 60s. And so you definitely had in the 70s this opening up of questioning, the nuclear family, all these things that make you not have to rely on the state, as it were. And Dirty Harry was, so popular, just like a lot of other things that you go, wow, it's amazing how cops go from Dirty Harry to being made fun of, donut eating fat guys that can't do anything, competently at all, bumbling boobs or whatever. And I always joke about TJ Hooker in the 80s, how it got to that point where the smart ones were private detectives, but all the dumb ones were cops. How quickly that's been taken out, and it's just a sign of the times. And for something like that with Dirty Harry to be so popular, a lot of film critics, instead of talking about it as far as a film, they would let their personal politics interfere with it. And so, unfortunately, I think the profession of criticizing films really has gone downhill. And even though I grew up on Siskel and Ebert, like a lot of people did, a lot of people were in print doing it, a lot of times you could sit there and say, well, I understand they don't like it, but the way they wrote it, I understand what I would like about it. So there's a consistency, but you're absolutely right. Red Dawn was, when it came out, was a film where people started getting pissy in the media about it. Instead of, hey, coming to you Friday night here, a double feature starring Red Dawn, Patrick Swayze, da 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 da. It was, oh, this movie's blah 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 blah. And now, anytime you go read any movie, whether it's on Netflix or coming out, you get somebody that you go,
warning.
why am I reading their opinion? They're just complaining about what they don't like.
I love the warning now in front of this movie. It's warning. This movie may make you think that guns are okay. it's this absurd censorship now. It's like we have to warn people. There be scenes of violence and uses of a gun. People are easily triggered. Should not watch this.
I'll close up here, talking about Will Wheaton and Sean Austin being in Toy Soldiers, because that's one that, I've talked about off and on over the years about doing, and we'll get to it, I'm sure, at some point. But I remember being a huge fan of the original Star Trek. That's what I grew up on as a kid with reruns and stuff. And when they started a second one in the 80s, I started watching it, just like I watched the Leave It to Beaver, just because it was there. And it really struck a chord to me as a teenager how progressive than this Will Wheaton version of Star Trek was with Picard, because Picard was a consensus builder. He would take input from everybody. He would take his two hands and just kind of tug on his shirt. He'd stick his pinky out and sip some tea and be the man that makes a very smart decision, as opposed to the guy that reacts with his balls in Captain Kirk. And it really became apparent with certain things like this that, well, okay, I understand you're doing something different. And while I was excited about being in the universe, I'm not even going to touch the politics of Star Trek, because they are certainly not American-based values at all. But even in the original Star Trek, they were, for the most part, doing a better job of hiding some of the progressive ideals that they had in there. And of course, there was a multicultural cast in the original Star Trek. That's cool. Things were done on that show that hadn't been done yet. That's cool. But they still focused on the writing, and Star Trek had probably some of the best science fiction writing in about a third of their episodes of anything on television at that time. But it got worse, because you know what? I will tell you this. If you watch the Will Wheaton version of Star Trek, 10% of the episodes where Will Wheaton can't get any. And then the other 10 are, why should I care about this guy named Data? Because he's a friggin' robot. Nobody cares about robots. They're not real. I mean, it was really ridiculous. I thought to myself, God, I must have just liked Star Trek for no reason as a kid. But when you watch them now today, especially with the relaunches, it's not even close to being what the original's like. Nothing at all. It's just a vessel for people to put in whatever they want. And it's kind of sad, really.
It is. Final thoughts for me on this is that it's just because something's controversial doesn't mean it's bad. And you're better. I mean, especially if it's in the 80s, you have a 50% chance you're gonna like it. And as we're today, you have a 70% chance you're gonna hate it. Because at least people back then were not held like accountable to pleasing Twitter users for movies.
So you see, if you like an 80s film and you've got a 2020s film there, you've got a 1 in 3 chance of coming out the winner. But since the 2020s suck, that's really 2 out of 3. But since 80s films are better anyway, we're going to divide that in half. So you got a 66 2/3% chance of liking something from the 80s automatically there. Anyway, some hardcore fans know where that kind of story.
Well, as long as it's Kevin Bacon, because you can never go wrong with Kevin Bacon movies.
Well, you know what? Red Dawn, good film. It's been picked on a little bit because of how serious it takes itself, but it's definitely worth a watch. And I know some of you in chat have seen it. Some of you, if you haven't, watch this one, then watch the 2012, compare them, and see which one you like better, see how they're different. And that's going to be an interesting analysis at some point, but very good film.
I mean, the fact that we get Powers Boothe in here just being an awesome, Army airplane, Air Force pilot.
Yeah, just off of playing a detective himself, actually, on HBO. He did some limited edition Philip Marlowe Private Eye ones too over the summers. I think 83 and 84. Those are very good too. And I go, wow, here's the 1980s version of Humphrey Bogart playing, detective, as it were. Really, really good stuff. And I think HBO had that.
And also, how many times do you get to watch an awesome movie with C. Thomas Howell?
Is that rhetorical?
That's up for you to decide as a viewer.
The odds go down. You had Red Dawn the mix. That's right. I'd like to thank RDV for showing up tonight, giving us this Midwestern version of the take on Red Dawn, because the more you go towards the Mississippi, the more important this movie becomes.
I'll just say this: if I'm ever invaded by Canada, I'll be the first one on the front lines. So I'll be protecting you guys from speaking Canadian.
And I'm sure they'll be polite about it. But they won't cross the border without a vaccine card, so I don't think it's going to happen.
They're going to come across for our maple syrup.
All right, guys. Hey, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching and checking us out, too. I appreciate the fact that some people retweet us. We're trying to up our game here and get a little bit more cross promotion, everything going out too, especially since we're 80s based. But RDV and I have been at it so long, we can definitely compare it to other things we do. So we like to steer the conversation to
4 years
we've done before.
Are we 4 yet?
We're over 3, almost
Jeez.
3.5
Ugh.
officially. That is correct, sir. Yeah. So that's pretty good, because I like to think that no matter who's reviewing what out there, whether it's a new movie or old movie, that our stuff's pretty cool. Dare I say extreme.
Extremely good or extremely bad. You decide. Leave a comment.
Yeah. All right, guys. Have a good night. As always, stay extreme.
Yeah.
If you love Red Dawn, go see Ghost. You betcha.